In the studio with me this morning, Tom Scanlon, who's no stranger to the Irish community in Cleveland. But he brought a very interesting guest with him named Maurice Fitzpatrick. And we're going to talk about the movies, but particularly one movie because Maurice really knows the movie business well. Tom, I want to talk to you about how you came in contact with this fine gentleman.
Well, I received a phone call one day. Someone else had suggested that Maurice call me, and he told me about his film. And as you know, Gerry, our law firm tries to sponsor every year a film that's an Irish film at the Cleveland Film Festival. So I mentioned to Maurice that I perhaps could get an opportunity to have his movie reviewed for possible screening at next April's Cleveland Film Festival.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people come to this festival. Huge.
Actually, 2 years ago, the Irish film, which was put together by our mutual friend Sean Lackey.
Sean Lackey.
That film grossed, both in people and dollars, the most amount of money the film festival ever did, other than the opening film.
Now, these films that they do with this, they're kind of out of the mainstream type of movies, right?
They are basically either documentaries or art movies.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of independent producers too, right?
Yeah, mostly independent producers. You may recall that your colleague who was in Florida today, Colleen, used to work for the film festival.
That's right. Yeah. So it's a big deal here in our city. Brings a lot of people.
A lot of people.
A lot of people come to the downtown, and it's concentrated in the area where you have your law firm, isn't it?
The film festival is concentrated in two areas now, Gerry. Downtown in the building that I'm in Terminal Tower. And they have had such a great success in the Gordon Square area, which is the arts district on the west side of Cleveland, that they utilize a theater there called the Capitol. They have 4 theater viewings there, so they run the film festival there as well.
I think you sponsored the Danny Green documentary there, didn't you?
I did. I think you recall, Gerry, that I think his wife, second wife, and sister were guests of ours, and we spent an evening talking about Danny Green after the show. I think you were with us at that.
Mm-hmm. Right. Let me get over here to Maurice. Welcome to our radio program. Is this your first visit to Cleveland?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Gerry. Yes, it's my first time ever in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm very curious to discover this city, the de facto Mayo City.
Well, there's a lot of great things in our city. In fact, last weekend I took the Irish consul on a kind of a mini tour of the city. He said he had no idea the great things, for instance, the arts, the universities, the museums. I took him around that area, and then I took him to Tom, you'll appreciate this, I took him to Lakeview Cemetery, which is really the history of our city. But that's another story. Let's talk about this movie of yours, because it's about somebody that I admire a lot, John Hume. So talk to me a bit about how you came up with the idea, or how you chose him as the subject matter of your movie.
I worked with John Hume in a previous film called The Boys of St. Columns, which is a high school in Derry in Northern Ireland. And the whole idea behind that film, which is also a book I wrote, was that the students of that college, through getting an education in Northern Ireland, and the result of mass education coming to Northern Ireland in the late 40s, well, when the late 1960s rolled round, these people started to demand a new society. The Catholic minority in the north decided that they wanted to form a civil rights movement, and of course Hume was a decisive leader of this civil rights movement. So I was working with John Hume on that film, and I became inspired not only with his activities as a civil rights leader and as a leader of local business, credit union. He was president of the Irish League of Credit Union, but also what he did much later as an elected representative, and particularly what he did here in the United States. He started to come to particularly Washington, D.C. and form alliances in the United States Congress and later the White House. So I thought that's a great story and I want to tell it.
Is the movie, did you write everything? Did you write the script? Did you do it all yourself?
Yeah, so I wrote directed and produced this
The,
film.
the whole bottom of wax says, so you can't blame anybody for anything that goes wrong here, right?
Yeah, but you must understand I'm blameless.
Ah, that's right. Talk to me about John Hume, because he was such a central figure, even in the peace process, everything that led up to the peace process. Were you surprised that he became such an icon of the peace process in the north of Ireland? Did it surprise you at all?
Well, I have to say that a lot of the troubles in Northern Ireland happened even before I was born. So I came to this as a student of history. I came to this as a person who wanted to discover the nature and the cause of the troubles. And I quickly found out that John Hume and others had advocated a constitutional approach to the Northern Irish crisis all the way. So in a way, it wasn't all that surprised. He was very, very consistent as a person. I mean, he based his analysis on clear-headed logic. He asked himself, through his examination of Irish history, where do we stand here? What can be done? And he emerged as a very clear thinker and a clear leader. So, yeah, I wasn't wholly surprised that.
Would you say he was a kind of a person that believed in peace at any price?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
As opposed to a Gerry Adams or a McGuinness?
He believed in peace above all. I mean, peace as a precondition for a decent society. Believed in the rule of law and human rights as a basis for collective society. And these questions, issues of human rights and issues of justice, by far outweighed any concern one might have about the border, about partition, about all the various things that had happened. Many of them were mistakes, or many of them were imposed by colonial power, the British. All of those things highly regrettable, but for John Hume the approach needed to be based on human rights and on justice. So yeah, peace, of course, was always a big part of his whole ethic and his approach to politics. Absolutely. He couldn't really conceive of a resolution in Northern Ireland independent of a peaceful approach.
I often wondered how he was able to counter, let's say when there would be a big bombing in the Catholic area and destruction of the Catholic property, and John Hume was able to get up there and convince those people to try to tell, don't riot now. Whereas McGuinness and Adams, on the other hand, would say, let's go out, let's go get them. How was he able to do that and still kind of achieve what he did?
He took his example from Gandhi, from Dr. King here in the United States. You can't beat them militarily. You can pick up a stone and throw it at the British Army and they're always going to have the bigger gun. What you can do, however, is to advocate for peace. Use your intelligence, use your education, and use your imagination. I referenced earlier that he went to Washington, D.C. in a very determined way, very many times a year he would come across, he would work with Senator Kennedy, he would work with Speaker O'Neill, and through accessing those core personages within the United States political system, he was able to say to them, look, I'm for peace, I'm for inclusive cooperation, and if you will support me in that, we can, in fact, rebalance the situation. We can reconfigure Anglo-Irish relations, quite apart from the relations within Northern Ireland, but the whole Anglo-Irish structure. We can do that, but we have to be for peace. And the fact that John Hume was that touchstone and was absolutely reliably on the side of peace, that enabled senior politicians in Congress and a series of presidents to align with him.
How was he viewed in the South, which is South of Ireland?
Well, in the South, let's remember, Dublin, the government needed a person in the North with whom they could work, whom they could trust. So a succession of Irish Taoiseach, called it Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, saw in John Hume that person. He was feted, he was celebrated, he was trusted. John Hume has a huge reputation in the South. Of course, in the North, it's slightly different. It's he's seen as a nationalist politician, of course, and Unionists may at certain points have viewed him with some suspicion what are his real intentions and so forth. And obviously there are rivals within the nationalist camp. You mentioned earlier Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, so people with different analyses and different approaches. So, but in the South, certainly very, very warmly received.
We're going to come back and talk some more. I want to talk to you about Clinton and the peace process, all that great stuff that happened. Very historical time. George Mitchell.
Like that the lilt in that story and the kind of the tone was that it's embracing it rather than rejecting it. I know that there was one scene described in the song where the families get together and of course a drink would be taken, and you know that's also a recipe for disaster. So thankfully we have a nice comic undertone throughout the whole song.
Mm-hmm. There are so many what we used to call mixed marriages in my day, in the young days. Did they work out? As said in the song, of course. They didn't seem to work too good, but was there a lot of mixed marriages in the north of Ireland?
Well, it's all relative. Not that many, really, and it was, and to some extent, still is a complex thing to do. It depends on your area. I mean, the north of Ireland, you know, there are pockets within Northern Ireland which are a good deal more tolerant than others. Mm-hmm. So it does depend, and it depends, I think, also on the socio-economic background of the people. If you're from middle class Belfast, you're maybe living in a mixed area and so on. It's a lot different to living in, let's say, the more working class parts of Belfast.
Now, what would be Hume's belief in that? Would he believe that there should be the integration of the Protestants and the Catholics? I think he did.
Hume took great pride in the fact that his ancestry were of Presbyterian stock. Now, he's a Catholic man himself, and his family's Catholic, but he embraced that. He had no bones about saying, you know, as a lad growing up in Derry, he played a bit of cricket as well as playing football, and he was very, very comfortable with the unionist identity, to the extent that it didn't attempt to smother the nationalist identity. That's where he drew a line. Mm-hmm. So where, you know, we can embrace both. He was always inspired by both this country in the way it's embraced its diversity, the 50 states, and also indeed continental Europe, where France and Germany, after not just 2 world wars, but actually centuries of conflict, sat down and decided to create the European Union, and indeed John Hume represented as an MEP the full constituency in Europe. So he's always saying, look, these big continents have managed to bury the hatchet, why don't we?
Did you meet any resistance as you're making the movie? Obviously you're a great admirer of John Hume, but did you run into problems with people on the other side, like Adams and the McGuinness crowd? Did you?
Well, Gerry Adams is in the film, and he was quite anxious to put on record that John played a very big role in securing peace. What I'm trying to do in this film, Gerry, is to assert that there was an evolutionary process in creating new structures, political structures in Northern Ireland. And there is a school of thought to say that it all happened in the 1990s. I think that that's demonstrably false, and those who believe otherwise, those who would wish to draw a line in the sand and say it started to happen in the 92, 94, whatever, I don't believe that they would agree with the thesis of this film. So while I haven't encountered what you would call militant resistance, I suppose ultimately some people may not support the central idea behind the film.
If John Hume had never existed, would we have the peace process in Ireland today?
Very difficult to say. I mean, the problem with, I suppose, history writing and making films about history is to try to define exactly the role that one personality plays. Because there were others, and I mean, his deputy leader in the SDLP, the Social Democratic Labour Party, Seamus Mallon, was a great force for peace and justice in Ireland, and many others. But Hume is widely accepted, and I certainly believe he was the architect of the peace, because, Gerry, he was also the architect of the political process long before the peace process. You read what he wrote in the 1960s if you listen or read back on the speeches he made in the Parliament of Northern Ireland in the late 60s, early 70s, read the end game he illustrated for the divided people of Northern Ireland. Very, very akin to what we have today. And it's a great tragedy for Northern Ireland that it took a considerable amount of time for some people to listen to that message.
Was his hope to unite Ireland, the 32 counties?
He is a United Ireland advocate, yes, but his hope was to unite the people, Gerry. He really believed in, you played that song there, the Unionist and the Orange and the Green. He said we need to discover how to create an Ireland which is capacious enough to absorb these identities and that it's not in any way rejecting or offending the identities of people. So he was very firm on that point. The constitutional question can and should be addressed, but it has to be addressed only through inclusivity. That might sound like a bit of a dodge, but if you give it some thought, it actually is a core departure in political leadership in Ireland, because if you look at what had happened in the South, Eamon de Valera's constitution, 1937, was very firm on the question of territory. The rights of the territory, and Hume was saying, well, let's look at this a different way. The people of Ireland are the people who have the rights, and only by creating a structure that is broadly acceptable to all communities, north and south, can we have a new polity. So let's focus on that first.
Would you say that John Hume was unyielding in his support for Catholicism in the North? Did he want the Catholic religion to survive in the North?
John Hume was not particularly apt to mix doctrinal questions of faith with politics. So, off the top of my head, I'm struggling to discover any time when he advocated for the Catholic faith in the midst of his political career. He believed, going back to what I was saying a moment ago, he believed in the rights of people to have a Catholic education and Catholic institutions, but he was aware of how others, maybe particularly on the Unionist side, had conflated religious questions with political questions and given people a so-called mandate to do very terrible things on the basis of a very false theological justification. So I think he would have been rather careful on that question.
We'll talk more after the top